the East Coast, and good morning if you're on the West Coast. Thanks for being here for today's Bloomerang webinar, an introduction to crisis management for nonprofits. My name is Stephen Shattuck, and I'm the VP of Marketing here at Bloomerang, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. And today's guest is Brian Goldthorpe. He's the President of Privileged Communication. Hey there, Brian. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is great. For those of you who don't know Brian, he has over 10 years of professional experience in strategic communication, public relations, organizational communication, and crisis management. And at his firm, he helps clients secure their reputations by consulting and training businesses, elected officials, political candidates, and of course, charitable organizations in crisis management and messaging. And he previously served as the statewide public policy director for the Pennsylvania chapters of the National MS Society. He was also communications associate for the Philadelphia Workforce Investment Board and a legislative aide for former Ohio State Senator Jeff Jacobson. And he holds a master's degree from the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. So we've got a real PR pro here. He's going to talk today about crisis management specifically for nonprofits, hopefully to keep you all out of trouble. So this is going to be a really great presentation, and it's just a real treat to have you here, Brian. So thanks again for sharing all your knowledge.
Absolutely. Thanks for giving me this opportunity. I'm excited to be able to chat with everyone and share a little bit of kind of introductory information to crisis communication and crisis management.
This will be great. So just a little bit of house cleaning, and then I'll hand things off to Brian. What's going to happen is he's going to roll through his presentation, and then afterwards we'll jump right into a Q&A session. And we like that to be interactive. So as you're listening to Brian's presentation here for the next half hour or so, please do send some questions our way through the chat box if you hear something that maybe you'd like explained or elaborated upon. Feel free to do that. We'll see those questions, and I'll be fielding those to Brian a little later on this afternoon during the Q&A session. And just so everyone is aware, I will be sending out the slides and a recording of the presentation a little later this afternoon. So look for that to hit your email inbox in case you need to bounce early or just want to review the great information that we're going to hear a little later on. So I'm not going to take up any more time flapping my gums. I'm going to hand it off to Brian to get us started. So Brian, take it away.
Great, thank you. And I just want to thank Bloomerang again for this opportunity. I've worked with elected officials and candidates for office, and I've worked with major corporations like AT&T, and I always come back to nonprofits and charitable organizations. When I was growing up, my mother was the executive director of our local YMCA, and I've always kind of had that charitable streak in me. And it's something that I'm very passionate about. I serve on a couple of boards myself, and one of the things that's always been a kind of a professional challenge to myself is to try and figure out how to take some of the skills and experiences that I've had outside of the charitable arena and apply them to the nonprofit world. And that's kind of how my interest in crisis communication and crisis management for nonprofits came about. I noticed that an increasing number of nonprofit organizations and some of the most beloved nonprofits over the last 4 or 5 years have had some problems with crisis management and with kind of managing their reputation. This has created a little bit of a trickle-down effect where local community-based organizations, no matter how large or small, are becoming susceptible to the same types of challenges to their reputation. And as I discovered in kind of speaking with people, most of them were woefully unprepared for how to handle these situations. I think we tend to view crises as problems that happen to celebrities and politicians and major corporations and folks that are really kind of up front and center in terms of their public visibility. So organizations that maybe don't have the visibility of a Susan G. Komen or a Red Cross don't necessarily think about crisis management often until it's too late. So I've been inspired to work with nonprofits to try and minimize this particular risk. And so that's kind of the angle from which I've approached this over the last couple of years. I've tried to take the expertise that I've developed through, through crisis management in politics and in corporate America, and apply those rules and customize those rules to be really applicable for nonprofit organizations. So the goal for today's discussion is really to provide a basic introduction to what is crisis management in kind of contemporary public affairs. What is it that we're referring to? I want to create a shared understanding amongst all attendees of the kinds of situations to look out for, and basically to provide some infrastructure that will allow you to think about your organization, think about the unique risks that are presented to you based upon the programs and services and the scope of your mission and how you execute that mission, so that you can start to think about how you do some crisis planning internally. I've been engaged by organizations that have already had a crisis happen, and I've come in to help them try and figure out how to respond to it. And I've also worked with organizations in advance of a crisis to help them put together a plan so that they have something tangible and concrete to activate if and when a crisis situation does occur. I'll tell you, it's much easier to work with organizations in the latter capacity to plan effectively ahead of time than it is to work with those who get caught with their proverbial pants down. So I'm big on preparation and planning, and you'll notice that through the course of the presentation. That's a recurring theme. So I want to get started with just kind of a basic overview of what crisis management is, and honestly, how do we define a crisis as it applies to nonprofit organizations? There was a time when the only crises of note were political sex scandals, when people had problems with, kind of celebrities had problems with their reputations. In this day and age, a crisis is something that needs to be thought about in a much broader way. I define a crisis as any situation that threatens a nonprofit's reputation or that may disrupt that organization's ability to carry out its mission. Using that definition, you have to cast a wide net to think about the types of situations that can become crises. For nonprofit organizations, a crisis can originate from a variety of causes, from fiscal emergencies and legal woes to leadership problems and staffing struggles. That's to say that you never really know where a crisis is going to come from. The best thing that you can do is have a plan and be prepared to act if something happens, and also know where your risks lie and how to minimize the likelihood that a crisis is going to occur. Now, though the origins vary from crisis to crisis, the importance of effectively managing these situations remains constant, and it really is playing an increasingly large role in whether organizations are successful over time. Never before have we lived in a media environment where public opinion can so quickly change. From social media to digital media outlets and the way that they interact with the mainstream press, one false move, one bad stakeholder engagement, one negative piece of press, one bit of information about financial mismanagement, that's all it takes, quite frankly. And so we're living in kind of a new era when it comes to crisis management, and no nonprofit organization is immune. The practice of crisis management is when NBC television shows like Scandal on ABC, people get a very kind of skewed idea of what crisis management involves. And basically, it's a lot less sexy than that. The crisis management is basically the standards that we use to measure which scenarios constitute a crisis, and amongst those, which require a response. This is basically your litmus test for your organization. This is something, again, that has to be customized for every individual nonprofit. You need to figure out what types of risks are those that need to be on your radar screen. How are you going to kind of assess those risks when they come up? And ultimately, what types of crisis situations or potential crises are going to warrant a proactive response? Crisis management also includes the methods that are used to respond to real and perceived crises. And this is an important point. a crisis does not actually have to be legitimate in order for it to require a response in this day and age. Because anyone can have an opinion, or anyone can levy criticism, or can make claims about an organization at will through social media and through other outlets. Oftentimes you have to respond to the perception of a crisis, the perception of financial mismanagement, the perception of problems with staffing, the perception of an organization's inability to effectively execute its mission, as much as you do to a real crisis. So those two are certainly related, and it's important in terms of the content of the crisis response, what you say about that crisis, that you understand if this is something that's real or if it's just the perception of a problem. Crisis management also includes, and this is where we're going to kind of drill down through the rest of the presentation, is the communication. It's how do you communicate about this crisis internally? One of the things that often gets overlooked for nonprofits is how do you communicate to your staff, to your board members, and to your partners, those stakeholder groups. How do you talk to them about a crisis situation in a way that is going to keep them engaged, it's going to keep building morale, and it's going to make them confident that there is a plan in place and that you're going to be able to weather whatever storm is coming your way. And certainly communication to external audiences, and that's any board, not board members, any members of the public who have an interest in the issue areas that intersect with your organization's mission. It also includes the news media and organizational partners that you may work with. So I'd like to kind of tell you the dirty little secret about crisis management, is that there's no magic bullet. A crisis mindset requires the ability to think of the worst case scenario while simultaneously suggesting numerous solutions. Trial and error is an accepted practice, and quite frankly, it's honestly the one practice that is most frequently used and probably most accepted, but most crisis management experts will not tell you that trial and error is a necessity. Oftentimes the first line of defense doesn't work. It's really necessary to maintain several strategies in your contingency plan and to always be on alert. I can't stress this enough, and this applies to all communications work and public affairs work. What works for one organization is not necessarily transferable to another organization. You need to have a crisis plan that has a comprehensive set of strategies, that has more than one approach. If your first kind of line of defense doesn't work, you need to have something else that you can activate. If you're not able to proactively get out in front of an issue, you need to have alternate ways of shifting the narrative and really allowing the organization to determine the terms of what the dialogue is about this crisis situation. So it's important to be creative. You need to be reflexive and flexible, and you need to have a real solid understanding of the unique risks that are presented to your organization and a laundry list of strategies to help deal with any problems that might arise. So I've alluded to this in kind of the introduction. Why is crisis management important, especially for nonprofits? In our social media savvy 24-hour news world, it's increasingly important for nonprofit organizations to plan, prepare, and preempt when possible crisis situations. While charities are generally appreciated, and they certainly have far more goodwill than politicians and businesses, they're not necessarily perceived as being innocent like they used to be. Well-publicized fiscal leadership and morale crises have stricken some of the largest and most prolific nonprofit organizations in the world. And as a result, all nonprofits have become more susceptible to public criticism and attacks on their reputation. An additional wrinkle to that is, and I spoke with Steve today, and I alluded to this, as media has become more pervasive over the last decade or so, people have also gotten more vigilant about how their charitable donations are being spent. When the economy tanked, there was less money to go around, and the money that was there to go around was being looked at with more scrutiny by donors. So you have more visibility, you have less overall funding available, and you certainly have, I think, stricter kind of compliance and standards in the way that organizations are being looked at. So you have more visibility from the media kind of converging with this trend of increased accountability for nonprofit organizations to make sure that funding is being used in the most appropriate way. It's vital for charitable organizations to establish a crisis team, create a manual that can be activated when a crisis situation occurs, complete some initial staff training, very similar to this kind of a presentation that I'm doing today, so that everyone across the organization, even if they have no role in managing the crisis itself, so that everyone in the organization has a shared understanding of what's at stake when a crisis situation happens and what to be on the lookout for. And when the staff training is complete, it's really necessary to prepare yourselves for an aggressive and fast-moving news cycle. One of the biggest challenges for an organization that doesn't often proactively seek visibility through the press, it's very challenging to all of a sudden have negative publicity. And one of the things that I try to do when I work with organizations is to bridge that gap a little bit. Say, look, you may not proactively seek out media coverage, but if a crisis situation happens, it's going to find you anyway. So we have to have a little bit of a paradigm shift with some organizations to think about how best to respond to the kind of media coverage that is going to come out, and ultimately get out in front of it so that the narrative from the organization is the one that is dominant and that people are hearing the most. A few more points about the importance of crisis management. Your credibility and reputation as nonprofit professionals and also as organizations are heavily influenced by the perception of your responses during crisis situations. Your stakeholders will expect you to emerge as a leader and minimize the impact of the crisis at hand. At the same time, detractors or competitors of yours are going to look for someone to blame. It can be an extreme environment, and it can literally happen overnight. And it's really incumbent upon nonprofits to establish a sense of normality, foster collective learning from the crisis experience. During crisis, one of the biggest challenges is to deal with any strategic challenges that you face, some political risks and opportunities, and make sure that the business of the organization is able to continue. Any nonprofit professional would tell you that their biggest concern is programs and services or research or whatever the means by which they use to execute the mission of their organization. Public perception does not necessarily fall real high on that list of priorities. So as issues with reputation and with crisis management are being handled, those things need to be compartmentalized a little bit so that the business of the organization, providing services, directing programs, conducting research, those functions can continue to happen. And that's one of the biggest challenges for organizations. But if handled effectively, a crisis provides nonprofit organizations with an opportunity to exhibit leadership, illustrate value, safeguard your stakeholders, and ultimately educate the public. I often say a crisis is an opportunity to turn a frown upside down. I try to create, out of every situation where all of a sudden a nonprofit organization may have an additional public platform to talk about who they are and what they do. Turn that crisis situation, turn the magnifying glass that has been placed on the organization, turn that into an opportunity to let more people know about who you are and what you do, as a fundraising call to action, as a call to action to help people understand the severity of issues and problems that you might be dealing with. There are ways to optimize a crisis situation so that not only are you able to kind of neutralize the threat, but you're able to turn this into a proactive and productive exercise. I've talked about preparation and planning, but I want to kind of reiterate that now in a little bit more detail, because effective crisis management absolutely begins early. It's necessary to know what your unique risks are as an organization, and that often intersects with your mission, with the population you might serve, with the nature of your stakeholders, with where your funding comes from, whether it's public funding, it's grant funding, it's donors, or a combination of those. And you need to know how to assess your risks. Not all risks are created equal. Some of those, and unfortunately for nonprofits, the risks that are always the most problematic are those related to financial mismanagement and oftentimes behavior of staff or infighting between staff. Those are the kinds of stories that the media loves to jump on. Because they're salacious, they have interesting implications for the overall health of the organization, and the public has an interest in those things as well. So you need to know what kinds of risks are the most severe and which really warrant a proactive response. Preparation and planning involves creating protocols, critically assigning roles and responsibilities. This is one of the most important parts of the planning process, is to make sure that staff and board members know who is going to be responsible for what role. In some cases, this involves bringing in external support as well. So putting together that action plan is not just what you're going to say and the content of how you're going to respond and who you're going to respond to, but it's a staffing chart of who's going to be responsible for what. How are you going to make sure that the leadership of the organization has the ability to sign off on strategies and tactics quickly? Who's going to be responsible for communicating with them? How is your internal communication kind of infrastructure going to interact with any consultants you have? What about if there are legal implications? How are you going to engage your attorneys? If there are financial implications, how do you engage your accountants? So a good crisis plan provides a roadmap for all of those different scenarios. And literally gives you a step-by-step formula to follow in the event that a crisis hits. And I also recommend practice, and this is something that needs to be customized for the organization, but doing an occasional fire drill to help leadership prep to activate the crisis response plan is not a bad idea. It's not something that needs to be done over and over again, but once the crisis plan is written, having a couple of well-timed fire drills that are coordinated by internal or external communication specialists is a good way to really make sure that you're on top of things and comfortable with the strategies moving forward. Taking these proactive steps early and often increases the likelihood that you will make sound decisions, take responsive action, and conduct effective crisis management. The only thing worse than not proactively responding in the face of a crisis is to respond inappropriately or inaccurately. And those kinds of mistakes are made when a plan isn't in place to figure out what to do. And you respond, you feel the pressure to respond, so you respond really thinking about the implications of what it is that you're saying. And you see this frequently, and then an organization has to come out and apologize for the response. It complicates the narrative, and it makes it seem like the organization is disjointed and disorganized. So a big part of crisis planning is to avoid those things from happening. So I'm talking a lot about communicating during a crisis. Now, the primary goal of crisis communication is to protect an organization's reputation when it's facing a threat. Most often, the goal is to minimize the damage and, as I said before, enable the organization to continue to function at full capacity throughout a crisis. And as I said, many crises also present opportunities to communicate new ideas and objectives. Crisis communication can play a significant role by transforming the unexpected into the anticipated and responding accordingly. In addition to kind of preparing, anticipation is a big theme that I talk about when I work with nonprofit organizations. And this gets beyond just the kind of the step-by-step plan. This gets into how do we create an opportunity from the crisis situation? How do we turn this around and really optimize it. And it's necessary to anticipate 4 key things. You need to anticipate the purpose, goals, and goals of your communication, as well as the messages that are going to be needed during the crisis. Some of those will be embedded into your plan, and you need to make sure that they're consistent with the overall narrative and kind of mission-driven language of the organization. To say it plainly, you can't go off script. Just because you're in a crisis situation doesn't mean that you kind of betray the identity of the organization. You need to weave that language into the content of your crisis response messages. You also need to anticipate what kind of philosophy are you going to use? What's your approach that you will likely use during this crisis? And I'll talk about that in the next slide. You need to anticipate what things are going to be of most interest in the news media based upon the nature of different crises, and potential stories both at the beginning and then as things evolve. Unfortunately, most crisis situations don't start and stop in a single news cycle. Oftentimes, the first information that is reported is only a part of the story. Usually there are other layers to be uncovered, and once other media outlets become aware of it, they're going to dig for things. So oftentimes a crisis situation is going to unfold over a period of days or a period of weeks. What a nonprofit needs to hope that they can do is to get out in front of it and become the source for media when they're reporting on this particular story. And it's important to anticipate specific questions that the media, policymakers, the general public, and other stakeholders are going to have. And to the best of your ability, script some answers to those so that the organization is communicating consistently and concisely. I mentioned philosophical approaches to communication in the previous slide. I just want to run through these really quickly. And the philosophical approach oftentimes depends on what types of programs and services or what type of mission the organization has, and also the nature of the crisis. So there are really 4 major different approaches. You can lead with concern. You can convey empathy and caring. This is most applicable if you have an individual who somehow has been harmed by the actions of the organization, whether it's a donor who feels their money has been mismanaged, or it's a recipient of a program or service who feels that they have been dismissed by the organization. You need to acknowledge, another kind of philosophy is to acknowledge uncertainty and share dilemmas and possible outcomes. There are some situations where it's just a challenging situation. And instead of pretending that you have all the answers when you may very well not, it's important to recognize that there's a little bit of uncertainty, that this is a process, and that you're doing and indicate what steps you're taking as an organization to get out in front of this issue, and being committed to being transparent and sharing your progress with your stakeholders and the general public and the media as things progress. It's also important to foreshadow potential or likely developments, and this gets into how the story evolves. If you feel that the beginning of the crisis is going to snowball, or you feel that there's going to be other information that comes out, it's better to cop to it early. If you talk about those situations up front, it takes the wind out of the sails of people who might be wanting to chastise you or criticize you for it. So that's another kind of philosophical approach that can be engaged depending upon the nature of the crisis. And the 4th kind of approach is to aggress and guide expectations. We expect, as the general public, and also your individual stakeholders, expect a lot from our nonprofit organizations. We expect them to run on very, very little overhead. We expect that you all deliver a very high level of programs and services. And we expect that you're going to be able to make everyone happy all of the time. That's unfortunately not reality. And sometimes your approach needs to simply be to level expectations and to make sure that people understand that there are complexities to the work that you do, there are complexities to running a nonprofit organization, and let them in on your process a little bit. Be transparent, be open, and be honest. I've mentioned stakeholder audiences throughout this presentation. Specifically, if you want to kind of compartmentalize them or itemize them, we're looking at issue experts. These are people who are frequently contacted by the media because they're considered experts in their field. And their field will typically intersect with your mission or the way that you execute your mission. If you take a kind of a health and human services-based nonprofit organization, you may get someone from the NIH that's an issue expert. You may get someone from a rival nonprofit organization who's recognized as an issue expert. So that's an important stakeholder audience, because if your organization ends up in the crosshairs, it's those experts who are going to be contacted to comment about you and about this situation. Your employees, arguably the most important stakeholder audience. Nonprofit organizations are nothing if they don't have morale and a sense of pride within the people that are working there. So communicating clearly and effectively with your employees about how a crisis situation is being managed is important. Board members and other leaders are an important stakeholder audience. Your partners and collaborators. These are organizations that you may work very closely with, that you have some kind of a symbiotic or reciprocal relationship with. They're going to be very important to keep in the loop as well. Then you have the kind of the general public, people that happen to have an interest in the work that you do, in the services that you provide, in the people who you help, or in the way that you go about your business. So sometimes that's referred to as an issue public or an interested public. And then you have the news media, and that spans, nowadays it spans everything, traditional and digital media, people who have blogs to the New York Times. It really covers everything. And also external public affairs staff, people that are feeding information to the news media. The goals of communication during a crisis are particularly important. You want to foster trust and credibility through timely, transparent, and when possible, proactive communication. You need to identify and explain any risks or potential risks. The goal is to address and ease the concerns of your stakeholder audiences. It's important to minimize harm, reduce the scope and magnitude of a crisis, and you do that by achieving high awareness and, if necessary, taking steps towards change. One of the biggest problems that I've encountered, and this is particularly relevant on the political side, and I don't know why politicians are so unwilling to recognize that they've made a mistake, but the willingness to not only own your mistake, but to commit to being a proactive participant in making the change that is necessary so that those mistakes don't repeat themselves. You generate more credibility and goodwill by being honest and open and committing to change if necessary than you do with any other message during a crisis situation. You need to give guidance, provide options, and make suggestions for helpful action. If you can accomplish those goals from a communication standpoint during a crisis, I think you'll be pretty successful in weathering whatever storm comes your way. So in terms of my last slide, and I want to make sure that we have an opportunity to answer plenty of questions, I just identified some keys to success. This is a little bit of a summary of some of the things that I've talked about already. You need to maintain connectivity with all stakeholder audiences. Minimize the disruption of daily professional responsibilities. Create an opportunity from every crisis. Be proactive and get out in front of the conversation and the narrative. Be accessible to all audiences, particularly the media, and you want to become, like I said before, you want to become the source on a crisis that is relevant to your organization. Show sincere empathy for any people, places, or organizations that have been affected by the situation. Be as transparent and honest as possible, provided there are no legal implications in doing so. And that's, part of the crisis planning protocol is making sure that the right people are involved in the kind of tactical or strategy conversation. Because a lot of the situations that have to do with, especially with financial accounting and how nonprofits are running their organization, a lot of those issues could potentially have legal implications. So you need to make sure that legal counsel is present, and also that accountants and CFOs have a role in that conversation as well, and that everyone is on board with the message that is going to be sent. It's also important to keep really detailed and secure records of all external communication. Make sure that you secure your private correspondence and confidential or internal information. I've seen this far too often where things have been accidentally sent to the wrong distribution list and subsequently have been leaked to the media. It happened with an organization I was very involved with, a national nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. There was a big struggle between their executive director and a couple of members of their board, and one of the members of their board decided to send this information to the media. They say inadvertently. I'm not sure how that happens exactly. But it ultimately ended up, the organization completely fell apart. Once the media got wind of it, everyone started kind of circling the wagons, and they had no crisis plan. They had no way to deal with a situation like this. So they just ended up, the folks that were already kind of pitted against one another ended up having a more public dispute, and ultimately the organization did not recover. It's important, as another key to success, to communicate early and often during a crisis and to become the source for the media. Communicate crisis response messages through several channels, including traditional and social media. You don't have to wait for the quote-unquote press for third-party validation. You can send messages about your crisis response through Facebook and through Twitter and through your own organization's blog and through your website, through your email blast. You don't have to wait for the media to cover a situation if you really want to get out in front of it. And ultimately, a multifaceted crisis communication plan is the best. It is something that will serve your organization well. It will help create a shared understanding across your organization, across all staff and all board members, of the types of situations that your organization is particularly vulnerable to. And it will minimize the likelihood that that those situations will become truly problematic. I like to say the best crisis plan is one that you don't have to implement. And if you do it correctly, you can minimize, you can't completely control it, but you can minimize the likelihood that a crisis situation will come up. So with that said, I want to take some time for questions, and we can keep going.
Yeah, great. That was awesome, Brian. Thanks for all that info. Wow, that was really fantastic. I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did just listening along. Awesome information, and I think you got some people thinking, because we've got a lot of questions here in the chat room. If you haven't asked a question yet, maybe there's something on your mind, please feel free to chat those in there. We'll just roll through these until we run out of time. We'll hopefully try to get to as many questions as possible. But Brian, I'll just kind of go through these as they came in. Leah here was wondering, she says when there's a bad incident that we cannot deny but could have prevented or could not have prevented, is it better to talk to the press or should they avoid comment? Is there ever a situation where silence is the best policy, or should you absolutely always respond to the press? What would you say to Leah there?
Unfortunately, in this day and age, silence or no comment isn't really effective. And it's actually, people view it as an admission of guilt. I'll give you an example, and this is not a nonprofit example, but a governmental example. Some of you may have kind of followed some of the bad behavior that the United States Secret Service engaged in when some of their agents had been traveling overseas. There was an issue in Cartagena, Colombia, that was really problematic. They were called on the carpet and went to a congressional hearing, and the director of the Secret Service at the time, his only comment to the press in advance of this congressional inquiry was no comment. And when he got before Congress, he said, basically, I'm not admitting to anything. I'm not even admitting I'm here because I'm being forced to be here by law, but I'm not admitting to anything, and I really have no comment. I'm not committing to making any change to change the behavior. And this was in the face of insurmountable evidence. So when ultimately that type of non-response was viewed as an admission of guilt. And so if it's I think that a response of some variety is necessary. If it's a situation that was truly unavoidable, explain it. If it's a situation where there was actually some wrongdoing, take responsibility for it, commit to change if necessary, and then move on. That's only the only real way to move on in an efficient fashion. If you let it linger, the chance that it will become bigger than the initial problem goes up dramatically.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm going to kind of bounce around. There's a question that kind of dovetails into that. What about timing? Talia here was wondering, is there a limited window of opportunity to respond, or is it a better late than never situation? Is there a rule of thumb that you should respond immediately? Should you take some time to maybe craft the response and make sure you've got all your ducks in a row and be a little more careful rather than rushing? What's your sense on timing of response?
Yeah, responses should be efficient, but they shouldn't be haphazard. You shouldn't feel pressured to respond unless you are confident that you have a strategic response prepared. Like I said before, the only thing worse than not making a comment is to speak incorrectly, inaccurately, or inappropriately. Those are the things that can make the crisis really blow up. So you need to take the time that's necessary to craft the appropriate response. It needs to be a priority, but you shouldn't feel pressure to respond if you're not ready. It is always appropriate to say, we will be making a comment shortly. You can always buy yourself a little bit more time.
That's good. So right away you could say that and then craft the actual response, with a little bit more time. That makes sense.
Exactly.
Cool. We've got another interesting question here. How do you communicate when confidentiality is an issue? So they can't convey details, but they still have to manage the crisis. So obviously this is going to be an issue for nonprofits, financial implications. Maybe if they're in healthcare, they can't divulge, those kinds of details. How do you kind of balance out that situation where you can't really tell the whole story, but you still have to manage the crisis?
Sure. It's tricky, and it needs to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, and it needs to be done in collaboration with legal, either internal legal staff or external legal counsel, however you handle your legal concerns and considerations. And anyone who has a role in especially as it relates to finances, anyone who has a role in financial oversight and accountability, they need to have a seat at the table as well. And oftentimes, a way to handle that is to not have the typical spokesperson, whether that's the president or CEO or executive director of the organization, have them defer to the legal counsel. It's seen as much more accepted practice if an attorney says, this information is confidential, we can't share it, as opposed to it coming from someone who's not a legal professional. So sometimes you have to pivot the spokesperson in order to send that message and have it be taken seriously. Otherwise, it can look like it's that the executive director, the leader, whoever the spokesperson is deflecting.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Brian, you told a story towards the end of your presentation about maybe some folks who didn't handle a situation very well. But can you think of a success story, maybe someone who handled a situation really well, maybe something that you saw or someone that you worked with? I always think of the Red Cross a few years ago when one of their employees accidentally tweeted from the Red Cross's account rather than their personal account, and they kind of got into trouble. I thought they handled that pretty well. Is there another situation that stands out in your mind where somebody just, they nailed this, all the things you've been talking about?
Sure. I worked with an organization based in Philadelphia, which is called the Mazzoni Center, and they had dealt with issues where their medical director for a while was being kind of harshly criticized on social media. This person has a peerless reputation. He's someone who has a lot of respect, who is great accreditation, and has really been responsible for helping this particular community health center grow. But he had an engagement with a patient that the patient wasn't happy with the advice that he gave him, and it turned into a situation where this person took to social media and really called his reputation into question. This particular situation is difficult because you're dealing with medical information, right? There's definite kind of HIPAA and confidentiality issues there. So the way that they dealt with it was twofold. One, there was a very succinct statement that was released almost immediately through all of their media channels, which were basically the doctor said, I have a commitment to all of my patients. I welcome this person to come back in and have a complimentary visit with me to talk about additional treatment options. And then there was, they rolled out in really quick fashion, rolled out a series of success stories from other patients that were all kind of in first person from that patient's perspective, and talked about some of the things that they have gained and some of the challenges that they've overcome from the services that they've received. So, and that was rolled out honestly within 2 or 3 days of this situation starting. Wow. So they had a bank of these human interest kind of testimonials, and they figured out how to activate them quickly.
I love it. So, social media. This is obviously a huge issue, and this is something that, and you touched on this in your presentation, that has kind of made this whole situation worse or opens the door to a lot of things. There was a comment in the chat that I really loved. Cheryl said, "Keyboard courage." I have been in the crisis-sensitive world for 20 years, but keyboard courage has broadened our challenges. So people maybe being a little, less afraid to voice their opinion online through social media. How do you deal with this? Is this just something that we have to deal with, that we have to live with, that people are going to take to social media and say things, whether they're founded in reality or not, or are there some things that you can do to mitigate, this keyboard courage that people have?
Yeah, I often say there's no accounting for crazy, and unfortunately there's a lot of crazy out there, and there are people who, for whatever reason, have, and honestly, the more success a person or an organization has, the bigger the target on their back becomes. Mm-hmm. And people are comfortable sitting behind their keyboard with as close to being anonymous as possible, and making horrible claims and allegations with no fear of repercussion or consequence.
Yep.
And it's the world that we live in. What's important with social media is figuring out what warrants a response. Everyone's opinion isn't legitimate, quite frankly. And if someone has a serious concern, or they take to the organization's Facebook page or their Twitter account, and they're talking about something that honestly has to do with how programs and services are provided, how the organization functions, then the best response is to say, we are welcome to have kind of a one-on-one dialogue with you. Offer the opportunity for that person to actually confront you. Right? Mm-hmm. That's the best response.
Yep.
If there's something that has actually happened where someone has been wronged and the organization is at fault, and they take to social media, admitting guilt quickly or admitting and taking responsibility quickly is probably the best way to put that fire out. Unfortunately, most social media attacks are not legitimate. They're not cut from that particular cloth. They're usually people who, if you ask them to meet with you one-on-one, you're never going to hear from them.
Yep. So kind of kill them with kindness, and they're not going to. You kill them with kindness, but you stop short of recognizing the legitimacy of what they're claiming until you have an opportunity to investigate it further. So this question of legitimacy is the subject of a question that Judy asked here. Judy was wondering, when a nonprofit is proven to be innocent or not at fault, so the claims have no basis in reality, how do you get the press to communicate that and not just the accusations. It seems like people are always willing to share the accusations and the juicy details and all that, but they're not going to go back a week later and say, hey, it turns out this group wasn't at fault and all that. Or does that happen? Can you make that happen?
Yeah, you can make that happen. The best way to make it happen is to give the press the actual information. Instead of filtering it through a spokesperson and just releasing a statement that says, hey, we were vindicated, right? You actually give, if there's a written record or some kind of supporting material that the press can read and they will draw that conclusion themselves, provide them the information and let them report on the information, as opposed to feeling like they're a mouthpiece for your organization.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's an effective way to deal with it. And it's also important when the reputation of the organization is at stake, the leader of that organization, when appropriate, when there aren't legal implications and other things involved, I recommend that the executive director or CEO, whoever's at the top of the food chain, be the spokesperson. Don't have it go through a publicist or an internal kind of communications person. They can help with the messaging strategy, but the figurehead of that organization needs to be comfortable being the person who's quoted and who's commenting. Making that person accessible to the media will increase the likelihood that you get positive coverage.
And a nonprofit has their own distribution channels that maybe they didn't have 10 years ago. I mean, you got your blog, all your social media channels. It seems like you can use that as well and not have to worry too much about the press.
Yeah, absolutely. The news cycle comes and goes every single day, almost every hour. So if the organization wants to make sure that it goes on record and is making a very clear statement, do that through your channels. Send the information to the press, but you know that you're still going on record through your own kind of content creation channels. And if the press doesn't report accurately on it, then at least you have still used your channels effectively.
Yep, makes sense. Well, great. That's a lot of the questions. I know we're kind of running out of time, and I don't want to go over because I'm sure folks have work to get done or lunches to eat. I do have to mention, Brian, that while you were talking, there were a lot of people asking for some templates or some response plans, some documents, maybe some resources. Is there anything out there that you would recommend? Certainly, I would invite people to work with you on those kinds of things. But have you seen anything good, or have you maybe made something yourself that the folks could download, maybe a physical asset, like a template or a plan or anything like that, or maybe some tips for making their own?
Yeah, I have different resources in my toolkit. Crisis management, I'm not a fan of templates for crisis management plans because they really need, there are certain areas that you need to cover, but it really needs to be customized for that organization based upon their unique threat. And so there are sections, and I can kind of provide an outline. There is content you need to include, but in terms of what that content looks like, that's going to be unique depending upon the organization. If you Google search crisis management template plans, you're going to find a whole bunch of responses. What's hard about utilizing some of those kind of generic off-the-shelf solutions is not having the kind of customized part of it. So you may have a template that provides you with 50% of the picture, but the rest of it you need to fill in yourself. One of the things that I want to kind of extend this offer to anyone on the call is to make myself available for a free consultation to participants that want to talk a little bit about their specific needs as an organization. I do have a lot of tools in my toolkit and resources I'm willing to share. With figuring out what are most appropriate and which are going to be most useful for your organization is probably something that warrants a one-on-one conversation. And so I want to extend that offer that if anyone wants to have an hour conversation with me where we can talk specifically about your organization's needs and create some resources and I can email some follow-up information to you, I'm happy to do that. I've always been passionate about supporting nonprofit organizations, and I think this is a space that's becoming increasingly critical for everyone to have a plan and really have a shared understanding of how to move forward.
Great. That's a very generous offer. I hope some people take advantage of that for sure. Do reach out to Brian. Follow him online. Follow him on Twitter. This is a serious PR pro. This has been really great, Brian. So thanks for sharing all your knowledge here for an hour or so. This has been a lot of fun.
Great.
And I will let people know
really
that.
Appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah, this has been great. And this has been recorded, so I'll be sending that out a little later today. I'll send out Brian's slides so you can review them. And I'll send out his contact information if any of you want to take up that offer. I hope you do for sure. Check out our website. We do these webinars once a week. We do these weekly. We've got a lot of interesting things here planned for April. We've got some folks coming on to talk about prospect research, capital campaigns, donor retention. Check out our website. I think there's a typo in that slide. I put too many O's in Bloomerang, so sorry about that. But check out our webinar page. These are free and open to the public. Register for something that you think looks interesting or could help you out. So with that, we're about out of time. I'll say a final thanks to Brian, and I'll say thanks to all of you for hanging out with us for about an hour and listening. And thanks to those who were good sports and sent over some questions. That made it fun, for sure. So with that, we'll cut it there. Thanks for joining us, and I'll be in touch a little later on with some of the resources from the webinar. So thanks for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.